Welcome to Open Minds, a Freedom of Thought podcast series, interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today.
Well, welcome, Randy. It's so good to have you here on the Freedom of Thought podcast.
Well, Josh, congratulations on having this podcast. It seems like it's going to be a very, very worthwhile enterprise for you.
Thank you. So let me start with your life and your career, just allowing our audience to get to know you a little bit. You've had a remarkable life. You grew up in Calumet City, Illinois, a Jewish kid in a small town, Catholic town. I can identify with that, having grown up as a Jewish kid in Fairbanks, Alaska. You went to Northwestern University, where I now teach, and then to Harvard Law School. Became a prosecutor and then an academic, first at Chicago Kent, and then for a while at the Boston University School of Law, and since I believe 2006 at Georgetown Law School, where you're the Patrick Hotung Professor of Constitutional Law. And along the way, you've rubbed shoulders with some of the giants of libertarian political philosophy, from Murray Rothbard to Bob Nozick to Richard Epstein, at least been in the same room with Friedrich Hayek, and worked with one of the great critics of libertarian political philosophy in Ronald Dworkin. And now you're one of the most influential law professors in America. You're a leading figure in three fields: con law, contract law, and political philosophy, again, especially libertarianism. And in a field where 500 citations is really good, you've got 24,000. Quick math here, what is that, 48 times a good score? That's lapping the field by a factor of 48, I think is pretty darn good. And you're a practicing lawyer with some important Supreme Court cases under your belt, including Gonzalez v. Reich, the medical marijuana case, and NFIB v. Sebelius, the Obamacare case. And you founded the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. Now you're writing a memoir about this incredible life you've led in the law. And I wanted to start out with this question. I'm always interested in the connection between someone's life and their work, their life and their thought. And in your case, between your life and your libertarian convictions. You're one of the leading figures in the political philosophy of libertarianism. Where do you think that comes from in your own personal story?
Well, it's really simple. It came from my dad. My dad was a proto-libertarian. He thought of himself as a conservative, and I thought of myself as a conservative. When I heard Barry Goldwater say extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in pursuit of virtue is in pursuit of justice is no virtue, this resonated with me as a 12-year-old kid. I debated on behalf of Barry Goldwater at the age of 12 in front of my entire junior high school student body. I actually still have some of my debate notes, including my summation in that debate. And so my dad was a libertarian-ish conservative before there was anything called libertarianism. He was very rock-ribbed, immovable in every conceivable way. And yet when I went to college and I discovered libertarianism and I came back and I started touting libertarianism to him, my unmovable dad himself became a libertarian. Because he'd always been a libertarian. We'd both been libertarians without understanding there was a political position. In fact, the political position hadn't been developed yet. So it comes from my dad. And my father was a contrarian about everything. I am somewhat of a contrarian, not as much as he was, but so that, and I grew up as kind of an outsider, which is something, by the way, Murray Rothbard once told me. And he thought most of intellectuals who make a name for themselves are not of the society in which they are. They're not completely of the society in which they're running with. And because they set outside of it, they can see things more detached and they see connections that someone completely fully immersed doesn't see. So I was a Jew in a Polish Catholic town. My graduating class of 400 had 4 Jews in it. And yet I went to synagogue across the state line in Hammond, Indiana, and that's all the Jews there were liberals or progressives, we call them now, but liberals we call them then. And I was kind of from the wrong side of the tracks. Calumet City was very D-class-A, and I had the wrong politics. So even wherever I was like on my own. And I think that just breeds a kind of independence of thought that you just carry with you for your whole life.
Our stories are our early stories are remarkably similar. My dad was a libertarian conservative.
I know your dad.
Yeah, as you know. And I grew up in I mean, Fairbanks, Alaska is a town of guns, trucks, and churches. Come from a sort of Jewish intellectual family. I remember my mom asking me why I didn't date more Jewish girls, and I was like, Mom, there are no Jewish girls in Fairbanks, Alaska. So same kind of background. I'm also interested in how libertarianism set you on the path it set you on in law school. I mean, you found your way to legal scholarship, but as a law professor, one is not a pure political philosopher. One is writing about concrete things like criminal law, civil procedure, contract law, constitutional law. What was the link from your libertarian convictions to your fields of research and teaching like contract law and con law?
Well, I was exposed to libertarianism like my junior year of college, and by my senior year of college, I taught a accredited seminar at Northwestern on libertarianism in the philosophy and religion residential college that they had set up there. So I taught this course, and then I went to law school and was again sort of isolated because there was no Federalist Society then. So I was in a section of 140 students, and I didn't know if there was anyone else in the section that agreed with me. There was no way to know that because nobody could identify. But ultimately, I had written a fan letter to Murray Rothbard, who I had never met, and he turned it over to another student who was starting Harvard Law in the joint Harvard Law MBA program named John Hagel. And John called me up the first semester, and he said, I got I got this letter that you sent to Murray. I'm a friend of Murray's, and we're going to get together. And he and I became partners in crime. We created a Center for the Study of Social Systems there, and then he was there. He was one of the founding members and president of the Center for Libertarian Studies, which was in New York. So he brought me down to New York, and that was the day I met Murray Rothbard, actually, when John brought me down. We were there to hear a lecture by Leonard Liggio, and Murray was in the audience, and eventually we ended up back in Murray's apartment running torts hypotheticals past him that were befuddling us as 1L students. And eventually, later that year, I was asked to be a member of the board of the Center for Libertarian Studies with a lot of other key libertarian intellectuals in those days. Eventually, Charles Koch joined the board, but that was later. And so I would spend a lot of time in New York rather than attend to my studies at Harvard Law School, developing the libertarian model. For example, the Center had a libertarian a Journal of Libertarian Studies. We had Libertarian Scholars Conferences every year where people would give papers. They would be published in the journal. We had a lot of activities, and I was very active in all of that. When I became a law professor, I went to law school to be a criminal lawyer. That's all I was interested in. And when I was graduated, I was a criminal prosecutor in Chicago. I got to do what I dreamed of doing, and it was even better than what you can imagine. Better than TV is what I like to say. But then when I went to be a law professor, I was by this time kind of tired of criminal law, wanted to do something completely different. And I had a very interesting, provocative contracts class taught by Roberto Unger, the only year he ever taught the course. And Roberto Unger was a stalwart of the critical legal studies movement, a very left-wing movement in law schools. And he taught this very provocative course that I found as a law student I couldn't answer his challenge. So I thought, well, maybe as a law professor, I can develop an answer to what his challenge was. And so I picked contracts as my subject to try to respond to Unger, which turned out to be responding to Duncan Kennedy, because a lot of what Unger thought was really from Duncan Kennedy. And that was what my first...
Can I just interrupt? What was the challenge? What was the question that you had trouble answering?
The challenge to freedom of contract, to what was called the classical contract school. It was a typical left-wing challenge to freedom of contract. And as a libertarian, we believe in freedom of contract. And there was a lot of objections to this that were coming out during the course of a full year contracts class.
So this is a good transition to the first sort of substantive subject I wanted to get into, which is libertarian fundamentals. I've used this word a number of times, libertarianism, as the label for your political philosophy. A lot of our audience are non-philosophers and non-lawyers and might not be familiar with the term and sort of what it means. Sometimes the same term or a related idea goes by the name classical liberal, which is even more confusing because the word liberal in our society doubles. It can mean progressive politics, modern progressive politics, and it can also mean this older tradition of thought connected to libertarianism, and often those two have very different policy prescriptions. So why don't we start here? What is libertarianism / classical liberalism? How do you define it? And why is the word liberalism used to identify two very different traditions?
Well, let me just begin by saying that there was a time in which I tried to transition from calling myself a libertarian to calling myself a classical liberal. This was something that people associated with the Institute for Humane Studies were doing at that time. And I was a visitor at Harvard Law School teaching there. And the people would ask me out to lunch, and I'd go out to lunch with these other Harvard Law professors as a visitor from Chicago, Kent. And they would say, well, what does a libertarian think of this? And I understand you're a libertarian, that. And I would say something like, well, I think of myself as a classical liberal. And it was after, and they went, what? What does that mean? I mean, now what is that? And then I realized after my visit, this was a huge mistake. I mean, they were saying libertarian. I was a libertarian. It looked like I was being defensive about being one. So ever since then, I've just owned up to it. I just own that label.
Yeah.
And so what is it? It's a fundamental belief in individual liberty. So it's an individualist idea that the fundamental units of society are individual persons who need to flourish in society with others. It's a social. Individuals need society, but society is made up of individuals, and these individuals have rights. And in Robert Nozick's words, there are things that you can't do to them because of these rights. There's things the government can't do because they will be violating what Nozick called the side constraints on government policy that are associated with the individual. Now, what exactly the scope of these rights are is, of course, the big question. And I did write a book, my first monograph, called The Structure of Liberty, Justice and the Rule of Law, in which I defend 5 fundamental rights that I think all human beings have, regardless of where and when they exist, different societies. And that is the right to acquire property from an unowned state, the right to use in the book called several property, which I think was going to become important again, which instead of private property, I called it several property, which was Hayek's term. The right to exchange their entitlements with other people, that's the right of freedom of contract, the right of self-defense, to protect your rights from others, and the right of restitution to get compensated if your rights are violated. These are the 5 fundamental rights that I defend, and my defense of them is distinctively, those rights are common to, I think, both libertarianism and classical liberalism generally. So classical liberalism is a broader tradition of which libertarians are a part, and I think it's a continuum. So the more you can get away. Libertarians believe in what I would call a parsimony of rights. I mean, normally libertarians are considered like rights fetishists because they're so big on rights, and I led with rights, right? So it sounds like I put rights first. But what libertarians want is the fewest rights that we can get away with, because every right is an authorization for the use of force. Every time you identify a right, it means force can be used to enforce that right. And so the more rights, the more force. The more rights, the less liberty there is. What you need is the irreducibly fewest number of rights that would still enable individual people to live in society with each other and to flourish with each other. And so there's how few rights you can get away with depends on will dictate how radical a libertarian you are.
So as I think about the different pieces of this tradition, as you set them forth, and also as I've encountered it in my own, with my father and in my own education, one part of it, to my mind, is the fixation on individual freedom or autonomy or liberty as the goal, the goal that stands above all others. And with that travels a sort of deep suspicion of state power, particularly the coercive force of the state. With that also travels a focus on the sort of unintended and often destructive side effects of well-intended policies. We institute a policy to help people, and then it has some destructive effect. So it goes beyond, the thought is, it goes beyond what the state ought to be doing. I would say also a suspicion of community, of the group, of the polis. The focus is very much on individual autonomy. Heard it put as a sort of right to be weird. So a desire not to be under the coercive control of a community and its moral attitudes any more than the state, and a sort of appreciation of the way in which community moral views are translated into state force. And with that goes a favoring of rights protections over democratic majority decision making. The idea is that we need a democracy, but we need to have democratic decision making cabined by our focus on individual rights. And then a view of the market as liberty protecting, as the zone in which liberty is realized. So a desire to sort of minimize the role of the state, though, as you say, to use the state where necessary to protect rights with force, but no more than necessary to maximize the sphere that is subject to market ordering, and to generally favor private institutional arrangements and their independence as extensions of individual freedom. So an individual is free, an individual creates a business with other people, and that is an extension of their freedom in the market and should also be respected as a zone of freedom. So what do you think of that way of setting it forth? Have I got the basic pieces of the puzzle right? Is there anything you would critique or?
Yes, I would critique your characterization of this approach as rejecting community and favoring autonomy. I distinguish autonomy from liberty. Liberty is the freedom to do what you will. Autonomy, at least in the Kantian sense, is sort of the having your will be independent of other people's wills, as opposed to heteronomy, which you're under the thumb of somebody else. I think all of us are under the thumb of lots of people. We're under the influence of lots of people all the time. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. So I've never, ever in any of my writings ever used the word autonomy. I only use the word liberty. So I would reject autonomy, and I also reject the idea that community is not important to individuals. Individuals are social beings. They need other people. It is torture to be in solitary confinement. There's a reason why people go insane if they're in solitary confinement, because that is it's contrary to our natures as social animals. And so I would reject those as being anything inherent in libertarianism. Now, there are individual libertarians who would probably agree with your characterization of those two things. Of course, one of the statements that those of us who've been in the libertarian movement have long believed, and that is the biggest problem with libertarianism is libertarians. So they're a motley crew.
Yeah.
And this goes all the way back. My friend John Hagel and I used to joke about this all the time when we were law students.
Well, let's talk about that, because one thing that's becoming it's clear to me, again, from my father and from my education, but certainly from our conversation already, is that this is an intellectual tradition. This is an inheritance. So when I think about the major figures in the inheritance, I think about classical figures like John Locke and John Stuart Mill, and then a next generation of Friedrich Hayek and Ayn Rand, who, as I understand it, really disliked Friedrich Hayek,
yes,
and Richard Nozick and Murray Rothbard. And then a subsequent generation that included Richard Epstein and indeed Randy Barnett. So that's my sense of the sort of lineage. The different figures here have different reputations in academic life. Friedrich Hayek is respected, worth reading, the thought goes, in universities today. Ayn Rand, she's very suspect, very frowned upon. And Murray Rothbard is very frowned upon. So I guess I'd like to ask how you think about this legacy, what you think we get from these different figures, and how you think about the ways in which they relate to each other. It might be too long a discussion, but who you think particularly goes right or goes wrong. Just give us a sense of your take on this tradition. And one last piece to that question. If someone listening to this or watching this were to read one thing from within this tradition, what would it be?
Well, I'm afraid I would have to recommend my book, The Structure of Liberty, because it synthesizes many of these things into one place. So it would introduce you to these other ideas. My book is very Hayekian, though. It is not Rothbardian. I got started with Rothbard and also David Friedman, who's Milton Friedman's son, who wrote a book called The Machinery of Freedom that came out when I was in college.
I probably should have included Milton Friedman in my list of great libertarians. Yeah.
Right. So there was a lot of infighting between all of these people. And if you were in the Rothbardian camp, Rothbard was quite jealous of some of the other people. He was down on Hayek. He was very down on Milton Friedman. And he was apostate from Rand because he had formerly been in Rand's circle, but he was expelled. So it was very interesting to be a part of all of this stuff. But it was after I was sort of out of the Rothbard group, which I was just in law school, that I started to be more accepting, and eventually incorporating Hayek, for example, into my thinking, such that when I wrote my book, my defense of the 5 rights I mentioned is based on their need to solve certain pervasive social problems that every society must solve, or we don't have a society. And I identify these 3 categories of problems as problems of knowledge, problems of interest, and problems of power. The problems of knowledge, which is where the book starts, is all Hayekian. And this is not anything like how Murray would have approached any of this stuff. It is consequentialist, although it is not utilitarian. The proof of the pudding is going to be in the eating. What kind of society do we have, and how well can individuals flourish in this society is the aim. That's teleological, which I do think involves consequences, and that's the approach that I take. But it was an extremely robust intellectual community, arguing with each other, publishing critiques of each other. My first published article was a critique of Nozick, and then I had another piece, critiquing Dworkin that I worked on with Ronald Dworkin when he had one of his chapters of Taking Right Seriously is why there is no general right to liberty, and I wrote an independent study paper under him saying what was wrong with that chapter, which I only went back and reread for the first time since I wrote it 45 years ago. Recently, and I was afraid to read it because I thought it would be bad, but I liked it. I think I might even try to publish it. Anyway, but I did have a very formative experience with Dworkin that we'll come back to later about things that need to be different, modifications that libertarians, I think, need to make. So anyway, it was a very robust theoretical time. That time is over. The libertarian model is no longer, it's not a community of people robustly exchanging ideas and improving each other. The originalism intellectual community is like that today. Originalists are various shapes and sizes, and they're arguing with each other and they're critiquing each other. They're actually converging on positions as a result of a very dynamic process of intellectual engagement. But libertarianism is frozen in amber from way back when Nozick and Rothbard and Hayek and Friedman, both Friedmans, David and Milton Friedman, were all arguing, and Lauren Lemaski, and Eric Mack, and Tibor Machan. These are all classic figures in the libertarian movement arguing with each other, but we don't have that kind of interaction anymore.
It sounds exciting. It sounds like being an artist in Paris at the turn of the century, or a philosopher in Cambridge during the time when Russell and Wittgenstein and Keynes were all hanging out. And
very much so. It was referred to as the New York Circle because it was all basically grounded in New York. The Center for Libertarian Studies was in an office overlooking Union Square in New York, which is where I went to the meetings of the board, and we did have our conferences there and elsewhere. So yes, it was extremely dynamic, and the model got developed, but unfortunately, I think the dynamism has been lost, and the model has been frozen for 20, 30, 40 years. And I think it needs, as we'll get to later on, I think it needs, like all models do, it needs to be continually thought about and enhanced and refined.
So one thing you mentioned was that you think originalism is now this active tradition, group of people sort of engaging with each other and producing something collectively that's more interesting than any of them could have produced individually.
Correct.
What's the connection between libertarianism and originalism? It occurred to me when I invited you as a guest that I could have the whole podcast be about libertarianism, or I could have the whole podcast be about originalism because you're known for both. There must be a connection. What's the connection?
Well, the connection is pretty simple, and that is that a written constitution is thought to be, by myself and others, including the founders of this country, to be a way of keeping government within its proper powers. And its proper powers are first and foremost to protect the basic background rights retained by the people. The Ninth Amendment says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And the whole constitutional structure is there to advance public ends. I mean, it isn't there just to protect rights. It's there to advance public ends of various kinds, provide for the common defense, et cetera, but not violate rights. And a written constitution was an American innovation, which you don't have in other countries. Well, you don't have it in Great Britain. That was meant to lock in a form of government that would be protective of rights. And the way you get lock-in is by saying that the meaning of the Constitution remains the same until it's properly changed by amendment. And that's a one-sentence definition of originalism. The meaning of the Constitution should remain the same until it's properly changed by amendment. And that's a means to the end of protecting liberty.
I think there must be one other element. Let me see if you agree with this. It's not constitutionalism itself that necessarily concords with libertarianism. It's the fact that the particular constitution we got is a libertarian constitution. I look at the German constitution. I'm not sure it's a libertarian constitution. Maybe certain elements are, and certain elements are certainly not. The South African constitution is not a libertarian constitution in that sense. The European Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Social and Economic Rights, which is a sort of constitution of Europe as a transnational entity, is not necessarily libertarian, but something about the founding in 1789 was pretty libertarian. Is that fair?
Yeah, I gave a lecture at Cato, the Simon Lecture, and the topic of my lecture that I chose was, is the Constitution libertarian? And my conclusion after analyzing the Constitution is that it is not strictly libertarian. It just happens to be the most libertarian constitution ever actually adopted into law.
Right.
And if it were followed, that is, which it isn't. But had it been if it were followed, it would be more libertarian than any other kind of document. So I think that's true. And then if you actually have a good constitution, you want the meaning locked in. But I do want to qualify what you say, and that is that the Constitution was improved in a very important way by the Republicans who came to Washington with an anti-slavery agenda and adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, as well as a bunch of civil rights laws. And the Constitution that I defend today is not the Constitution of 1789 or 1791. It is the Constitution that we have today, which was significantly modified in the 19th century for the better with respect to the protection of individual privileges or immunities of citizenship, as well as the rights of all persons to the due process of law and the equal protection of the laws.
Those are wonderful qualifications. It's almost like to think about originalism today, we have to think about the Constitution of 1789 and the Constitution of 1868.
Yes.
And the founders includes Thaddeus Stevens as much as it includes James Madison.
John Bingham is, who is principally responsible for the wording of Section 1 minus the citizenship clause. Yes, absolutely.
Now, when I think about the libertarian tradition and critiques of that tradition, I think of critiques coming from both the left and the right. The left critique is that libertarians give undue emphasis on equality and compassion. And those two are entangled. Sometimes these are cast as arguments about justice. I think they're most clearly cognized as arguments about equality and compassion. The political worldview is one in which you focus on the people who are worst off and you try to raise them up to the level of everyone else. And that's a demand of equality. It also indicates a kind of virtue, a political virtue, which is also a private virtue, the virtue of compassion. I think it was Martha Nussbaum. I might be misquoting here because it's from memory, but she says, if I recall, compassion is the first principle of government. Regardless of whether I've quoted her quite accurately, I think that's the animating idea in the left critique of libertarians, that they don't care enough about the worst off, they don't care enough about equality, and they don't care enough about helping the worst off. So I'd like to just put the critique to you directly. What do you think about equality, and what do you think is the place of compassion in politics?
Well, first of all, the libertarian commitment to individual rights is as strictly egalitarian as any conceivable theory would be, because each person's rights must be equally protected. Herbert Spencer, another famous libertarian, called it the law of equal freedom. That was his basic principle. That's what libertarians believe in. They believe in Spencer's law of equal freedom. Everyone has the equal rights to do what they will with what's theirs, so that they don't violate the equal rights of others. So it does matter what you're going to be equal about. And so that's a matter of some dispute. What is the measure of equality? But not the fact that libertarianism is at its very root egalitarian in nature, because it is. In terms of compassion and caring, it's very important to distinguish libertarianism, which is a political theory, from any moral or ethical theory, which is basically how we ought to live our lives. Libertarianism is not a theory that tells us how we should live our life. Libertarianism is a theory that says what political structure is necessary to allow people to live the good life, to live a life that's moral and true. And authentic or whatever. And so you need a moral theory to tell you how to live your life, but you need a political theory to enable that to happen. That's the relationship.
I think the left critique is that that's not enough, that there ought to be, that we ought to use the instrument of the state, we ought to use politics to discharge our moral obligations to help the least well off.
Of course that is their view. And then the pushback from classical liberals generally, not just libertarians, is that every time they try to instantiate that into the real world, they end up immiserating people. They end up imprisoning people. They end up canceling people and impoverishing everybody. So when they try to implement their compassion through the political means, I'm not saying that every single thing they do is bad, because I think that's a mistake some libertarians make, which is to say, well, if the state has done it, then it therefore must be bad. That's not true. The state does things. When I was a criminal prosecutor in Chicago, I worked for the state. I don't think what I was doing was bad. Regardless of whether there should be criminal prosecutors, what I was doing wasn't bad. Somebody needs to do that job. So I don't take that view that other libertarians do. But if the state tries to do all of these compassionate things, what we'll end up with is a very bad situation. That's a longer conversation as to what that dynamic is that leads us in a bad situation. But that's my short answer, that trying to impose a morality on people using the state, as opposed to allowing people to pursue the good life themselves, is actually going to lead to terrible, terrible consequences, whether that morality is coming from the left or the right, because you just have the same kind of forces coming from the left and right. They just have different theories of morality at any given time.
I remember my mom saying that when she was a little girl, she asked her father about America and why he's patriotic, why he loves America. This is my grandfather. And he said, "We are a great and a good country." And he pointed to the Marshall Plan. Not only did we defeat the evil of the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese, but after defeating them, we invested in rebuilding their countries. So we're great and good, we're compassionate. She said it filled her with a kind of American patriotism, a kind of spirit that never left. That was sort of a faith for her after that. And I think what it indicates is that this need to look at your country, your government, your state, not just in terms of these principles, first principles of sort of keeping the social order while we live our private lives in freedom and hopefully with adequate kind of sense of justice and morality and compassion on an individual level. We actually need our government and our state and our politics to fill us with a sense that we are committed to something nationally that is good and that is doing good. That was her experience as a little girl, and I think it might just be a basic human need. Do you think it's a basic human need?
Well, I was trying to figure out what the question was going to come out of this story. I was just waiting for the question. I would love the story. There are a lot of basic human needs, and these basic human needs they can be good, and they can be put to bad uses as well. The human beings are very complicated. Human beings are capable of horrible, horrible things, and they're capable of very noble things. And a good society is one in which the good things are encouraged and the bad things are discouraged and sometimes punished forcibly. So it's just difficult to talk about these things in general, I think. I am a very proud American. I always have been a very patriotic American. My Jewish father said he was actually anti-Zionist for two reasons. One is he thought it was a really bad idea to get all the Jews in one place where they could be eradicated. And it was good that we were spread out. And secondly, he said, America, the U.S., is the promised land for Jews and for him. And so I believe that's true. I think it's because of the principles for which it stands, which is part of the Pledge of Allegiance, the principles for which it stands, which is not to say that there shouldn't be, and this is where I think some libertarians go wrong, that there shouldn't be a connection between the political theory and the moral theory. That is, it's also important not to think that these are two hermetically sealed theories that have nothing to do with each other. In fact, it's hard to know why liberty is valuable unless you know what liberty is valuable for. Liberty is valuable for, in my view, human flourishing. Now, as soon as we start talking about what the conditions of human flourishing are, now we're basically talking about a larger concept of morality or moral theory. In my case, it's Aristotelian Thomist, which is where I should mention my great teacher and mentor, Henry Veitch, who was not a libertarian. He was a social democrat, but he was the person who exposed me to natural law when I was, before I became a libertarian, in college, my freshman and sophomore year, and I have been an Aristotelian Thomist ever since. And so I do think it's necessary, and this is going to be part of what I will be working on in the future, to draw a closer relationship between the political theory that libertarianism stands for and a moral theory as well. And I think it's something that libertarians have given short shrift to.
So with that, let's transition to the present situation. I'm going to start off with a thought that I expressed at a previous podcast as well, that there are some things you know when you feel them. You know when you're having fun, you know when you're in love, and you know when you're free. There is a pervasive feeling of being unfree today. Whatever might be formally true about the way our state functions or our legal system, people feel unfree. And yet, the pervasive sense of being unfree is not coming from the government in any obvious way. It might be coming from the government in a non-obvious way, and we can talk about it. But it seems to be coming from the social sphere, a sort of interpersonal lack of freedom, and from the institutional sphere. It's coming from our jobs, from our universities, from our workplaces, the institutions we participate in. Not only is it not coming from government, but it's not the use of coercive force in a traditional sense. It's not violence. It's not backed by violence in an obvious way. And sometimes it's financial, like getting fired, but it's not always that. Again, it seems to be interpersonal and institutional. If I were to characterize the interpersonal side, I'd say that what we see is an America where our culture is increasingly defined by ostracism and the threat of ostracism. As you noted earlier in our discussion, human beings are social, and ostracism is one of the very worst things that can happen to us. And also moral condemnation, right? Moral condemnation is kind of the cousin to ostracism. But what really happens is people disagree with a prevailing ideology, and they are morally condemned, and their social opportunities are diminished, their social esteem is diminished, and that gives them the sense of being pervasively unfree. I think for good reason. It's amplified by social media, but it's not purely that. It's not purely a matter of technology. There's sort of some sort of like the volume control on the stereo is being turned way up with social media, with Twitter, with Facebook. But
to 11.
To 11. But it's a 7 without that. It's still happening. It's also institutional. Part of being a societal being, right? Aristotle said we are social beings. We are also societal beings. Part of being a societal being is we're constantly participating in various institutions. We're at one now, the Federalist Society. You work at one, Georgetown. I work at another, Northwestern. We might be part of a synagogue, a temple. We might be part of a condo association. We might be part of our spouses, maybe they're doctors. They're part of hospitals. They're parts of nonprofits, et cetera. You see the point. There's this pervasive institutional sphere, which is neither the state nor the individual. It's the institutions in which we participate. And this institutional sphere is increasingly characterized by institutions adopting ideologies, often very left ideologies, and insisting in those ideologies in the way it relates to the people it deals with. So you can be punished for disagreement, but the punishment isn't coming from the state. It's coming from the fact that your employment is in doubt, your opportunities to move up in the world, to be promoted. My students are terrified of being outed as conservative at their law firms, and suddenly good work dries up, they can't make partner, maybe they get fired, things like that. And it's happening in businesses and universities and hospitals, the very sphere of institutions that libertarians have traditionally valorized and protected. So I guess I have a few questions here. The first one is, do you agree with this analysis? This analysis of being pervasively unfree, where the lack of freedom isn't coming from the government, it's coming intersubjectively and it's coming institutionally. And does that mean it's time to rethink some of libertarianism's premises, and which of those premises would we rethink?
So my answer is yes and yes.
Okay.
I do accept this characterization. I might qualify it a teeny bit, but for purposes of this discussion, I accept this characterization of the kind of culture war that we currently exist in. I myself have to be very, very concerned about what I say and how I say it, given my position. And I also believe that libertarianism as a political theory needs to be adjusted to reality. In fact, the working title for the project I want to work on immediately when I'm done with my memoir, which should be very soon, is called Real World Liberty. And the subtitle, which was just suggested to me yesterday by a student in my seminar, which I really like, and that is Reconstructing Libertarianism, because it's going to actually be informed by Reconstruction and what happened with Republicans were doing after the Civil War. But let me get back to an anecdote that sort of illustrates this for me. It means something to me. I told you I was a student of Ronald Dworkin, and I wrote an independent study paper under him my last year of law school, critiquing a chapter of his in Taking Right Seriously, in which he argued why there is no general right to liberty. And I made an argument that his argument didn't work I don't get into the details of why his argument didn't work, but in the course of meeting with him to discuss my paper, he taught it Oxford style, where he got into your paper. He didn't criticize me from the outside. He said, well, here's what you have to do from the inside. And at one point he asked me a question, and he said, if you had to choose between a world in which there was more liberty and less property, or more property and less liberty, which one would you choose? Now, my argument, and it's actually partly my argument in the structure of liberty, is that property, the institution of private property, or several property, I called it after Hayek, is necessary to figure out what is liberty, as opposed to license, because not everything we do is necessarily liberty. So because of the priority of property in this sense, I opted for, I would choose more property over more liberty. And then he said, well, that means then you're not a libertarian. You're a propertarian. So that has stuck with me. And I think, in response to your paper, that libertarianism kind of needs to be a little more focused on liberty and a little less focused on property. Now, this is something that lefties, and somehow very left libertarians, outside of our libertarian movement, people who are really on the hard left and call themselves libertarians, they've been saying for a very long time, but they're against private property. I am not against private property. Nevertheless, I think that our current situation has revealed the fact that threats to freedom, threats to liberty, can come from private institutions. I will tell you one hypothetical that we used to debate back in the day when we were all arguing with each other at conferences, and that is, supposing, because this will date who I'm talking about, will date the thing. Supposing that the Rockefeller family came to own all of New York, and the Kennedy family came to own all of Massachusetts, and therefore it was private. Would we not have the same problem with that as we have with the government of New York and the government of Massachusetts? I think the answer to that was, yeah, we would. Even if it was private, it would still be the same threat to liberty. That was a hypothetical we had back then. We're kind of moving in that direction, where much of the institutions that govern our lives are, quote, private. But are they really private? This is what I want to work on. I think that libertarianism needs to take account of this, and it needs to take account of some other things. So can I move to one more thing?
Yeah, I'd like to hear it. Let me just clarify that first one. So the first one is that we have to have a more capacious understanding of what threatens liberty. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah.
The libertarian tradition is to think that it is the state that threatens liberty. So we maximize the spheres of operation that are independent of the state, including the market and including private institutions.
Correct.
But then you live in an age where there are profound threats to liberty. Again, you know when you're in love, you know when you're having fun, you know when you're free. I know I'm not free. Why? It's a culture of condemnation, which is an interpersonal phenomenon, and it is a unified institutional sphere, which is not quite interpersonal. It has to do with the sphere, I guess you're calling it a sphere of property. If you care about liberty, you might have the same goal, but adjust your sort of dethrone the state as the one and only threat and start looking at other threats coming from other spheres.
Right. And I agree with that. That is what I think needs to be done. It needs to be thought hard about, because it's hard to do that. It's hard to make that move, because then you got a lot of lines you have to draw, a lot of distinctions you have to make that are not always going to be easy to make. But I do think that's true. And this is the reason why I'm not abandoning libertarianism, because liberty is still going to be the ultimate value. It's not the ultimate value. Let me just I got to stop for a second because I don't want to be misunderstood. Liberty is not the ultimate value. Human flourishing is the ultimate value. Liberty is an essential means to human flourishing for many reasons that we can't get into now. So when I say liberty is the ultimate value, I sort of mean it's kind of one of the ultimate political values. It's not the ultimate social value. I want to be clear about that. But liberty is still the touchstone of should be the touchstone of libertarianism, and take into account realistically where the threats to liberty are coming from.
There's one step I'm wondering if you're ready to take it. It has always seemed to me that if the threat to liberty is coming from institutions, including private institutions, there might be a more robust role for the state in protecting us from those private institutions. And that could, not sometimes what the state is doing is pro-liberty. Sometimes what the state is doing is protecting us from being discriminated against as Jews or whatever else that we happen to be, as African Americans, as Hispanics, as women, whatever. The state protects us from threats to liberty that arise from the private sphere. Are you ready to take that next step into saying, well, what can the state do to curtail the ways in which universities are behaving in ways that are contrary to human liberty and flourishing? The state do to curtail the way private businesses are doing that are threats to liberty?
Well, Josh, I write books to answer questions that I can't answer without having written the book. Right. I don't write books because I already have the answer, and I'm just going to write it out as a book. People just assume, well, I have the idea, now let me write it up. No. The writing of the book is how I solve problems. So I don't have my position yet because I haven't started this book yet. I'll start it soon, and hopefully it won't take me too long to do it. But I can't answer all those kinds of questions. But I can tell you that one of my starting points is how the Republicans dealt with the notion of citizenship. How the anti-slavery movement in this country developed the idea of citizenship, and their concepts got absorbed by the Republican Party in a process that is described in my co-authored book with Evan Bernick, The Original Meaning of the 14th Amendment. We tell this whole story about the development of this theory of citizenship. And so let me just offer this suggested critique of how libertarian theory has operated. And that is, libertarian theory, the model that we were developing, is what I would call a state of nature model. It's a model of how things should work in the state of nature. This is why they're all premised on natural rights. But we don't live in the state of nature. We live in civil society. And the theory of civil society is you leave the state of nature because, A, this is the Lockean view, you want better protection of your natural rights. But once you enter into a world of competing governments, we have 200 some competing governments around the world. We are not in the state of nature anymore. We are not in Kansas anymore. And so therefore, more is necessary in the real world. This is why this is called real world liberty. More is necessary in the real world that might be necessary in the state of nature. And what you get when you enter into civil society is what you get are civil rights. Libertarianism has no theory of civil rights. Libertarianism needs a theory of civil rights because it needs a theory of how you protect liberty in civil society from which you have civil rights. African Americans confronted this problem in the South, which privatized as close as possible the pre-existing state-authorized system of slavery in the form of Jim Crow laws. Some of them were laws, but many of them were just social practices enforced by private violence and social pressures, so that African Americans faced a phalanx of businesses who would not do business with them. Private businesses, gas stations and hotels and restaurants Sure, they were free to use the public roads, but how are you going to use the public roads if you can't stop and use the restroom? As a result, the early Republicans passed a public accommodations law called the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The Supreme Court invalidated it. But they thought that there was a civil right to non-discriminatory access to places of public accommodation, that the civil society requires that in order to protect liberty, among other things. But in the case of African Americans, it was definitely their liberty, the liberty to travel, the liberty to exist in various places. Libertarians need to take this on board. That's why the subtitle of the book is Reconstructing Liberty. It's consciously, I think, modeled after Reconstruction, when our model of government started to include a theory of civil rights. That means there is a role for government. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment authorizes Congress to protect civil rights. And that's what Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to do that. So yes, now, what I haven't said, that's the starting point.
Right.
I haven't said is what follows from that. Now, you started asking me about universities, and we could talk about social media companies and common carriers and other. There's lots of things we could say after that I'm not prepared to say today. But this is where I'm starting from. Libertarian state of nature theory is not adequate to be a theory of how you protect liberty in civil society when you have 200 plus competing governments. It's just missing. It's missing that.
One thing you're building into libertarianism here is history. A lot of libertarians that I've read, it is put forward as pure philosophy. It's very abstract, right? But what you're building in is a clear apprehension of sort of the lessons of history for how to protect liberty. How do you do it?
Can I underscore that? The concept of property that John Locke defended and that libertarians have taken up, that didn't come from John Locke. It was a pre-existing institution that Locke was theorizing about. First came the institution, then came theories about the institution. And I think most of what libertarianism is based on are historically developed concepts that are then recognized, systematized, rationalized, and defended.
It also sounds like you're going to be engaging with, maybe even drawing on people who are care about liberty in some sense, but they're not associated with the right, they're associated with the left. They're thinking about how do you effectuate civil rights for African Americans in the Jim Crow South, for example.
Of course, sure. But, that was the history of the Republican Party. They were founded as an anti-slavery party, and it's their greatest legacy. The Democratic Party was a party of slavery and the party of Jim Crow. That's their legacy. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat, but I'll take the Republican legacy over the Democratic legacy any day, if I'm forced to choose.
And you want to draw on that early legacy, that John Bingham, Thaddeus Stevens, Republican legacy, and sort of build it into.
And my hero, Salmon Chase, who developed much of these theories prior to the Civil War, beginning in the 1830s, when he became involved in the anti-slavery movement as a political abolitionist, or what was also called a constitutional abolitionist, as distinct from the radical abolitionists that were the Garrisonians. The Garrisonians, I think, were the precursors of libertarians because they ultimately became anarchists. If you're a state of nature theorist and you want to stay in the state of nature, that is the anarchistic option. But if you leave the state of nature, then you need to adapt. And I think libertarians have naively thought, and including myself, I include myself in this, they have naively thought that you could just import elements from your state of nature theory into civil society and they'll work as individual isolated elements, and that doesn't follow. What might work, and we'll concede would work in the state of nature, might not work so well in a civil society of 200 competing governments.
Okay, so we're seeing a real radical rethinking of libertarianism's premises, given historical information and present experience, but still keeping that North Star of liberty fixed. The North Star of liberty. The question is
liberty, individual rights, private property, freedom of contract, self-defense, all of those fundamental rights I defended in the structure of liberty, I will continue to defend. The issue is what else is necessary besides those rights.
So we might see a 6th and a 7th and an 8th right in the book to come.
We'll have to see.
We'll see.
This is what I don't know.
What about the market? I think a lot of people, a lot of libertarians have assumed that if a business is, let's say, like Twitter is discriminating in their terms of service against conservatives, there would be market forces of competition that corrects that. If YouTube is discriminating, for that matter, if a Yale or a Princeton or a Harvard or a Stanford becomes pervasively ideological, the forces of competition will lead to corrective mechanisms. And so the market will function. It'll take a little time, but the market will function. Are you starting to doubt that? Do you have the sense, which I have, that the market is not working and can't be relied on to work, at least in the medium term in which most of us live our lives? We know it won't correct these things in the very short term, and that it might in the very long term. But in the medium term in which most of us live our lives, we're not going to see corrective mechanisms. Or is your sort of faith in the market undimmed by present experience?
Well, I want to start by saying that overwhelmingly, the market does work as you've just described it. In fact, even today, overwhelmingly the market works the way it has been built to work and the way you've described it to work. However, there have always been sort of regulatory exceptions to the market. Going back to what I said before, that the concepts that libertarianism has been based on, property and contract, these are theorized versions of something that historically has existed in the common law. Another principle that has historically existed in the common law is the notion of common carriers. And the idea that there are certain institutions that are common carriers, they hold themselves out to the public, but they're privately owned, but they perform a public function. Privately owned, I should say non-governmental, but still a public function. And with respect to that narrow category, it's narrow in the common law, they cannot deny service to people. They cannot discriminate with respect to giving service to people. The same thing was true with inns. Non-governmental inns have a public function, and they cannot deny anybody who basically is prepared to pay for a room access to their room. They can't discriminate. So this is also part of the common law heritage that gave us all the rest of these principles of common law heritage. I think this needs to be incorporated also into libertarian thought. Into basic libertarian theory.
So the thought is, we're still fans of the market. We still believe it works the way it should most of the time, but we're going to have an expanded conception of market failure, and it'll start to include, or might start to include. I want to acknowledge that you're working your way through these things, but
I haven't even started working my way through them yet. Just to be clear.
So we're brainstorming together.
Yes,
but the common carrier exception might point to a set of market failure style exceptions. If you're trying to communicate and you try to forward, famously with the Hunter Biden laptop story, Twitter made sure that tweets failed. So if you tried to forward the New York Post story about the Hunter Biden laptop in the weeks before the election, your tweet just wouldn't go out. It wouldn't send. It was what in the law is called viewpoint-based speech discrimination. But of course, they're a private company. So given the state action requirement, they're allowed to do that. And you might think, well, no, they shouldn't be allowed to do that because they're a common carrier.
Well, telegraph companies, when they were invented, they were very soon thereafter considered to be common carriers.
Yeah.
And we would think of our cell phones as that way. I mean, we don't think of our cell phones as being able to censor, monitor what we say, and protect the country from hate speech. So this is a very familiar category. It just has to be libertarians haven't theorized about it. It hasn't been incorporated into the libertarian model. It's there to be incorporated. And then once it is, then you have to draw lines that are not going to always be easy to draw. But you can't, all those hypotheticals that we were running past Murray Rothbard when we were 1Ls, he couldn't answer any of those hypotheticals, which was an eye opener for us. Because we thought, well, we're just first year students. We can't come up with the libertarian answer to our torch professor's hypotheticals, but here's Mr. Libertarian, we're in his living room. He can't do it either. To me, that meant, wait a second, first of all, abstract principles don't decide individual cases very well. But secondly, libertarian theory needs to be expanded in order to handle some of this stuff.
Is that expansion big enough? That's the thing I have doubts about. So let's say that you expand your conception of common carriers to include Twitter and Google and YouTube and other modalities of communication in the online world. It still doesn't address the problem my students are facing, that virtually every one of the law firms with good reputations and high pay. The ordinary employers for law firm graduates, unless you do something extraordinary, go to a boutique operation or start your own operation. All of the conventional employers are embracing an ideology that they don't share, and they fear sharing it at their firm or being exposed as having it at their firm and getting fired or never making partner or something like that. Likewise, the doctors I know are worried about being outed at their hospitals. And likewise, students at universities feel like, well, I've got to go to a prestigious university. Maybe they're wrong about that, but so they feel. And the prestigious universities and even the not so prestigious universities are, for the most part, embracing a common ideology that they find oppressive. So none of those are common carriers in any ordinary sense. And I'm wondering if your exception is big enough to deal with the problem.
Well, I don't think empowering the state to somehow come to the rescue of your students is going to be a workable strategy. I don't think, I mean, the state is not our friend when it comes to this kind of thing. The administrative state, or the deep state, has been in the United States has been almost completely captured by the same forces you're now attributing to these private or non-governmental sources as well. So I just don't see a white knight coming from the government in order to save us from this. If you're in a culture war, you've got to fight the culture war. You can't expect, there's not going to be some magic bullet or magic switch or magic machine you turn on and all of a sudden you're going to win the culture war. The culture war is a war over the culture, and it needs to be fought. It is being fought. I don't know, there was a while in which I thought it was really being lost. Now I'm not so sure that it's being lost, but it's hard to tell in the middle of the fog of war, which is what we're in right now. Whether we're winning or whether we're losing, we may not be either right now. This is where you have to fight it. But what are the means of fighting the culture war? Well, the means of fighting the culture war are, for example, free speech. Free speech. Free speech in public, free speech from the government, and maybe free speech from non-governmental purveyors, platforms, right, who are speech platforms like your cell phone.
But it also would have to be institutions more pervasively. Let's say that Twitter is subjected to common carrier regulations, and a young conservative lawyer at a law firm is tweeting pro-life stuff, and Twitter can't cancel him any more than the state could cancel him. But his firm can fire him. That's not free speech.
Yeah, look, I don't know that there is any solution to this. I don't have one today as I sit here. Maybe at the end of this, maybe when I have enough of the theoretic. See, I work from theory out. Now my theories are based on reality, so that it's not like I'm just sitting here in an ivory tower just dreaming up a theory. My theories are grounded in reality. But I have to start with the way I work, my process. This is what all my work is doing. I start with the theory, and then once I am satisfied I have a working theory, then I will start seeing what my working theory can deliver. I can't start with all the deliverables I want and then maybe have a theory that will fit all of the deliverables. And so I just haven't done that work yet. I'm sort of suggesting some ideas to you now, like, for example, if you're fighting the culture war, the means of war, the weapons of war need to be protected. What are the weapons of a culture war? It is speech. That's if I'm a gun owner, I'm a concealed carry permit holder. I think in some areas, physical force is necessary to protect yourself, and I'm hopefully prepared for that. But on the culture war, it's speech. So you criticize the law firms, you criticize Georgetown. I had a tweet on Twitter yesterday criticizing Georgetown Law for not having hired a single right of center public law constitutional law person since I was hired in 2006, and it's gotten 500 or 600 likes and 200 retweets. That's not great, but it's better than nothing. It struck a chord. But that's because I was allowed to speak on Twitter. And that was so I'm pushing back at Georgetown that way. Although I can also push back internally. So I don't have a magic answer to all this question, to the problem that I concede in the beginning. Not concede, I would insist that we have. But I do think part of the answer is to recognize that we don't just have two categories: government public, non-government private. These are two different concepts lugged together, and there's actually a third and middle category, which is non-government public. You have government public, non-government public, and you have non-government private. The private realm is what we normally associate with libertarian principles. And the government is the government. But in the middle, there may be non-discrimination norms and other civil rights that one has in the middle norm, which is not the same as the others. Now, there's actually a fourth category to be complete. There is government private, like, for example, a government office building, a military installation. We can't all go there. So that's completely private governmental. So this is where you start. This is where I start. I start with theory. And then based on this is how I've always done it. And then based on that, I try to build out and see what conclusions I can reach from that.
I love that thought, the 3 or even 4 spheres of activity. I was in a debate with Will Boat, as a matter of fact, on private power in October. And that was my first move in the debate, was to say that we make a mistake if we think there is a public sphere, which is equated with the state sphere, and a private sphere, which is everything else. There are at least, I said, 3 spheres. A sphere of genuinely private sphere, which is an individual and his or her immediate environment and social environment, like this family. A public sphere that includes the state, but also I said a third category, a public institutional sphere. A lot of our public life is lived in the institutional sphere, and it's properly public. And in my view, properly subject to democratic control.
Well, you know who understood the existence of that sphere, even if they didn't necessarily agree with everything you might want to do in that sphere, and that is the Republicans who wrote the Civil Rights Act of 1875.
Yeah.
It was a public accommodations law to regulate that sphere. Now, the Supreme Court held it unconstitutional because they said it was banning private activities that were not state action. So the Supreme Court stopped us. It was a Republican-dominated Supreme Court that stopped us from getting this civil rights law 90 years before the public accommodation law got repassed in 1964. But under the Commerce Clause, because of the precedent of the Civil Rights Act cases. Anyway, so the existence of this third category is something that the Republicans recognized. I became an originalist because I read anti-slavery constitutionalists like in particular Lysander Spooner, who I think identified a theory of originalism that I could get behind. That's how I became an originalist. And the modifications I want, or the improvements or the reconstruction of libertarian theory that I want to see done is going to be inspired by the Republican Party that existed after the Civil War.
Let me ask one more question about this rethinking of premises. And it is this. I am struck by the extent to which the culture wars that are unfolding represents a sort of class phenomenon, a sort of elite milieu versus a majoritarian milieu. Here's what I mean by that. Many of the preoccupations of cancel culture, of the woke movement, as it's now called, of identity politics and political correctness, as it was called a generation ago, they are areas of pervasive agreement among people who go to, let's say, Ivy League schools or other kinds of elite schools. But they don't have, and by the way, people who man or staff institutions at the highest level. And the state, as you said, they're the people who occupy the deep state, the administrative state, and they're the people who do things like run universities or run law firms or run hospitals. But actually, if you poll publics, they don't agree with this at all. They don't agree with most of this stuff. They have very different values and attitudes. And if you had a more straightforwardly majoritarian system, a lot of these woke ideas or cancel culture ideas just would not prevail. So what we have is something Marx theorized, as a matter of fact. We have a class consciousness. It's not class consciousness among workers, it's class consciousness among a sort of professional elite class, people with advanced degrees. And their level of political power is being put against democratic power, and that's the basic structure of the fight as I see it. Could that mean a more favorable attitude to majoritarian democracy among libertarians? A sort of recognition of the fact that part of what majoritarian democracy does is prevent pervasive institutional control by a ruling elite.
Well, let me begin by saying Marx did not invent class analysis. Classical liberals had a class analysis as well before Marx had his, and it was based on the state and people who were aligned with the state formed one class, and then there are people were a different class. I'm not a big expert on this, but I know it's true. I know it happened, and so that's number one. Marx borrowed class theories and made it his own. And something like a class theory, a classical liberal class theory, is what I think that you're working on, that you're sort of working towards. But I forgot the second. So how did you finish your point? Because I just forgot my second point.
I was interested in whether, one of the ideas that has come to me is as I've sort of thought about these problems, is the role of popular democracy, of majoritarian democracy in fighting ruling elite.
I wrote a book about this. It's called Our Republican Constitution.
Okay.
Protecting Liberty and Sovereignty. Actually, I forgot the subtitle of my own book, but it's Liberty and Sovereignty.
You've written a lot.
Right. I defended a Republican Constitution versus what I called a Democratic Constitution. So I'm still, then in the book, I try to explain what the difference is between these two. So I am still not a fan of democratic majoritarianism, and I think neither were the founders, and the Constitution was set up as an anti-democratic institution, and that's one of the things that made it so good. That's why it is such a libertarian constitution, because it's anti-democratic in a fundamental way. However, I do believe in democratic checks on power. I don't believe in democratic governance. I don't believe in majority will. Yeah. Which is a very Rousseauian idea. And in fact, the Democratic Party, when it was founded in the 1830s, the modern Democratic Party was very consciously Rousseauian in believing of the common will. And they called themselves the democracy. They didn't call themselves the Democratic Party in the very beginning. It took about 4 or 5 years before they started being called the Democratic Party. They were the democracy against the aristocracy, they said. At any rate, I think that electoral checks on power and the ability to remove our rulers by means of elections is a very important part of Republican government. It just isn't to be acquainted, which I think you are doing instinctively, with democratic governance, majoritarian governance. I'm against that. I think that's majoritarianism is the problem for which a Republican Constitution is the answer. It is not the source of legitimacy. It is something that needs to be constrained in order to achieve legitimacy.
In the present situation, you might not agree with this descriptive analysis, but a present situation that I would describe as one in which there is a sort of top 10% in terms of education and income and cultural influence that is directing our shared public life against the will of most of the other 90%, that doesn't cause you to rethink your preference for republicanism over democracy.
No, although I don't dispute the premise. Well, it's a somewhat optimistic premise because you're claiming the 90% for yourself, and that may be a little optimistic.
It's definitely a little optimistic, but stipulate it for the sake of the argument.
I do think we have an elite, and I think, by the way, you and I are in it.
Define in. I remember what you said before about always being
on the
in context where you're on the outside.
We went to all the same schools, and we have fancy pants jobs and fancy pants universities, and so we are part of that group. Nevertheless, we see the group for what it is, being part of it. We're on the inside looking around us. Other people are looking at us from the outside, and in fact, I think we have a very corrupt and deficient ruling class of these elite. Our elite leaders, our elites are bad. Our elites are not doing us any favors, and that is part of the culture war. And I'm not, I think there's a corruption that's happening below the elites as well, thanks to them, thanks to their policies. So that's why I'm saying your scenario is pretty optimistic to think that there is a uncorrupted mass of the people who are with us against the corrupt elite. I think it's more complicated than that. But I'm a very strong believer that the people who are running the show are running us into the ground.
Would you like to, I think we're just about out of time here. Do you have any closing thoughts you'd like to share about libertarianism as a tradition, about adjusting to the present situation? I just want to keep this question open for you to address as you like.
Well, I'm old enough to remember when the term libertarian was considered such a weird word that we were all looking to try to find a better word, and none of us could think of a better word. So we went with this. And now I think actually the word libertarian is still a pretty good word. It's enough to draw criticisms from the left, as you say. And if you go to a national conservative convention, as I have gone, there's a gratuitous obligation of them to attack libertarians every 20 minutes, even if it's not relevant to what they're talking about.
Sometimes you by name.
And sometimes me by name. And so this is an instinct that they have. And so I just want to say, I think this is a philosophy that's worth preserving. I ran it past my students last night in my last meeting of my seminar. I ran it past my students last night in my last meeting of my seminar whether I should abandon the term libertarian myself because of what it might communicate. They all, after talking about it for some time, agreed that I shouldn't. It is me, and it is a view that's worth fighting for. But I just want to say that some of the criticisms that are coming at libertarianism from the left and some of the criticisms that are coming at libertarianism from the right are well-founded. And they need to be dealt with by improving, or in my sense, say, reconstructing libertarianism to take account of these challenges and make it a better theory than it now is.
If I could close on a similar note, it's just to say that I admire you for being a leading member, a leader in every sense of the world of this political philosophy without being a dogmatist. Most people who are sort of holding the flag of a certain viewpoint aloft are dogmatists, and you're not. You're rethinking things from first principles all the time. You've done it from the time you were in your 20s, maybe from the time you were in junior high school. But you're doing it in light of experience and reacting to present circumstances and trying to have new thoughts.
And rational critique.
And rational critique, including from political opponents on both sides.
Yeah.
So I admire that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Open Minds, a Freedom of Thought podcast series interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today. To learn more, visit freedomofthought.fedsoc.org.